Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bronė Lenkevičiūtė-Vasiliauskienė, the Partner Relations Manager from VTEX. And today with me also is Aušra Vaškevičienė, the Director of the Services Department from Martyno Mažvydo's National Library of Lithuania. And let me introduce you to our honored guest, Toby Greeną, the former head of publishing from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And yesterday we have had an open access publishing conference held by our cluster named Science and Education Technology Publishing Cluster in Vilnius Visory Information Technology Park. The purpose of that conference was to promote the collaboration between public publishing institutions, libraries and private sector. And today we are going to talk about open access challenges for university presses, libraries in fast-changing scientific publishing environment. And Mr. Toby, could you let us know how OECD contributes to open access movement?
Well, strictly speaking, the OECD is not really involved in the open access movement. It's not a scholarly publisher, it's not a funder. So in a way, it has a peripheral impact on the movement. However, it is a publisher in terms of it publishes its own work, and there's a lot of pressure, being a publicly funded institution, to make its content open. Formally, the OECD it released in 2012 some principles and guidelines for access to research data from public funding, and that's a formal document from the Council of the OECD. But on open access, in a way, the OECD has remained silent. It has no particular opinion. However, the OECD's publishing operation, it has a mandate from the OECD members, and the mandate is to do two things. One is to maximize the dissemination of the OECD's content, and the other is to raise a sufficient revenue to pay for the cost of publishing, because the members have decided not to self-fund the cost of publishing. If you have that dual mandate, which is what I had, you have to maximize dissemination. Well, if you put a paywall on it, you can't maximize dissemination. But if you have no paywall at all, then you can't earn the revenue. So we ended up with a freemium model. So it's a porous paywall. So all the content is available to be read for free. Yes. But if you want the premium editions, which you can play with, are actionable files, then you need to be a subscriber. And this freemium open access model is in fact unique to the OECD and one very small French publisher. No other publisher that I'm aware of uses the freemium model. So that's about the extent of the OECD's relationship with open access.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is about Plan S. So in September 2018, Plan S for publishers was launched. It is supported by 22 national and international funders, as we know, and also it includes European Union, and how this movement can force the change in open access publishing for small publishers.
Well, Plan S has achieved one thing, and that is it stimulated an enormous amount of noise and attention in the scholarly publishing community. But for me, it remains to be seen whether it will have a real impact in terms of forcing the pace of increasing the amount of content that's open access. Those funders only represent about 10% of all research funding, and therefore they only impact on a small proportion of all the scholarly content. So bearing in mind that only 20% of content is born free today, even with adding on Plan S, maybe that number might get up to 25% or maybe 30%. But it remains, for me, it remains to be seen how much of a real impact it has. I'm also uncomfortable with the concept of forcing change. Plan S is trying to force change, and I really understand the frustration that funders have with the slow progress towards open access. But I fear that Plan S and other similar mandates, they fail to address the central reasons for why the slow progress. So fundamentally, I think there are two problems. One is that there is an ever-growing number of articles that's seeking publication, and that the pace of that growth exceeds the amount of money, or the growth in the amount of money that's available to pay to publish those articles. And therefore you've got a problem right from the beginning in terms of affordability. The second thing is the role that journals play in the hiring, promotion and grant giving process.
Yes.
And the reason why authors still want to submit their papers to closed access journals in preference to open access journals is because the closed access journals are the ones that have been long established, and therefore they have the greatest utility in the careers of scientists. Plan S does not address that. And this to me is a problem, because unless and until this problem of the journals being used as a proxy for measuring the quality of a scientist's work, then it's very hard to see why scientists are going to choose to publish with open access when it's available.
And is it the same in humanities publishing and scientific, technological, medical publishing?
I don't think there's much difference across the disciplines, other than one fundamental problem, which is in humanities and social sciences, there's much less money available to the author. And therefore the idea that an author can afford an article processing fee to make their content open, it's really beyond the bounds of reason, because they simply haven't got the money. And it's why also you can see there's a lag in the volume of social science and humanities content being open access. The other huge difference, of course, is that in the social sciences, and particularly in the humanities, the book is still an important form of communication. Books are very expensive to publish, and therefore the APC is even higher, and therefore the challenges of making that content open access are even greater. So, so in a way, there's a asymmetry there in terms of the desire to make the content, but also the cost of making the content open access is much, much higher.
Okay, thank you. And librarians are responsible for access to information and take care for subscriptions to the databases and other e-resources. What challenges will face libraries, small publishers, universities, presses beyond Plan S takes an effect?
Well, again, it's hard to focus just on Plan S. The central challenge for everyone, I think, is the same. And that's both for the publishers and for the libraries. First of all is the access to adequate funding. Library funding across the world is under pressure, and that is a central challenge for everybody. It's very difficult to operate when your budgets are under pressure. The second thing is the balance the need for investment against day-to-day operations. The digital publishing is not yet stable. And I've been in this game for so long that I can remember analog publishing. And analog publishing, there was no concept of investment. You invested in expanding your portfolio, you invested in finding new authors, but you did not have to invest in technology. Today you have to invest in technology, and that's really expensive. And if you're a small publisher or you're a small library, your ability to afford that investment is a significant challenge going forward. And that leads me on to the third point, which is one of scale. If you've built a process to publish journals or books, once you've built the process, whether you publish 1 book or 100 books, doesn't cost any more. But to build that process in the first place is super expensive. And therefore, everything tends towards, in a sense, scalability, and the large players have an insignificant advantage over the small players. And that's, I think, a big challenge for small libraries and small publishers. And then the final point is the access to skills. I know one small international organization publisher. They put out about 30 reports a year. They have 1 person dedicated to publishing. So this one person has to do editorial, has to do production, has to do marketing, has to do IT. Of course, they can't do all those things.
Yes.
And so these challenges, again, it gives the bigger players a huge advantage because they can afford to hire the specialist skills that are needed to in a sense, to effectively manage complex content and make it available in a useful way to readers.
And why these challenges you have just mentioned are so important to publishing society as a whole?
Well, publishing often has the image of being a sort of a cozy cottage industry. You know, there's this sort of close relationship between the editor and the author, and they're all sort of working together in dusty rooms, crafting knowledge for the benefit of society. And that might have been true in the analog age, and it was certainly sustainable in the analog age. I remember going to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and all around the edges of the big halls there were these tiny, tiny publishers having these really small stands, and they were operating in little niches. They've all gone. They're not there anymore. They kind of, either they've literally disappeared, or they can't afford to be at Frankfurt anymore because of the costs and the growth of costs. My sense is that mainly they've gone out of business because there's no way in a digital age they can keep up with the costs. And therefore this business of scale, this business of speed in terms of investing in your platform, investing in your content so that you can apply artificial intelligence engines to your content, it all comes down to scale. We've just completed a project at the OECD using artificial intelligence, and the company that we worked with, they said that they can't effectively use their engine on less than 100,000 pieces of content. So if you haven't got 100,000 pieces of content, you can't do AI. And therefore this business of scale, this business of being small is a really big issue.
Yeah. And what action can help small presses in dissemination of scientific content? You measured platform, and what maybe else should be done?
There's also a tendency to put your content in one place and think, great, everyone can find it. And I don't believe that's true for a minute. At the OECD, we have a platform, and a lot of people use it. But lawyers will never use it. Lawyers use one of two platforms. They either use Westlaw or they use LexisNexis. So if we have content for lawyers, you have to put it on one of those two platforms. Otherwise, it's simply not going to get used. And it's the same if you want to hit bankers, you've got to be on Bloomberg or you've got to be in Reuters. In the tax field, there are a couple of small players where the people who work in international tax, that's where they go for their content. So small publishers have got to be alert to the fact that they have to also not only present the content in their own context, they have to think about where else can I put the content, where it's going to be, where it's going to find its audience. There's another piece of the puzzle, which is persuading authors to promote their content. So many authors in the academic space, they what I call launch and leave. You know, they launch the work, and then they just seem to forget all about it. They assume that the work will find its audience, and in my experience, that's absolutely not true. You've got to get out there and promote the work in social media, at conferences, and that requires effort. It requires using tools. There are tools out there that can help to do this, but it mainly requires a mindset, which is my work hasn't finished when I've published. My work finishes when I've actually got an audience. And then I've yet to find many authors who think about that second step. The other thing that I think that small presses could do, and that is they can look at what I call their back office processes. So that's things like warehousing and fulfillment and accounting and all of the non-core tasks. Is there a way that you can share those with other presses? Is there a way that you can outsource those to providers so that you don't have to do it yourself? And I think there's a lot of opportunity for publishers to collaborate in the areas that are behind the scenes, rather than trying to do it yourself, so that you can focus on your added value and says what your secret sauce is, rather than trying to do everything.
Yes. And the last question from me is about open access model as a whole. What does it mean for a publishing society, and why does it mean, and could we move forward with that model, or it will be only 25% and that's it?
Well, I think that it really depends on two things. It depends on where you get your funding from, or where you think you can get your funding from, and can you get your costs down. And I think it's so vital to look at both of those pieces. So where's the money coming from, and how can I do things cheaper? So if you can then find a sustainable source of funding that enables you to go open access, and the key is the sustainable source of funding, there's a lot of short-term funding available, and the problem is when it runs out, what are you going to do? And so it's really vital to look at funding in the long run. But if you can do that, then obviously you have more freedom to make your content open. But again, it goes back to the point I was making about outsourcing non-core tasks. If you can pool those with other people, then your overheads can go down, and if you get your overheads down, then maybe you've got more room to make your content open access.
Aušra is having more questions.
Yes, as a librarian, I would like to know what you think about transformative agreements, because funding is very important for publishers, and funding also libraries need funds for subscription.
Indeed. I have to say I don't think much of transformative agreements. I can understand why they've arisen. I can understand that libraries are beginning to say, I've got a bunch of authors, I want my authors' content to be open, therefore I will do a deal with the publisher to effectively pay for the APCs out of my subscription money, or was my subscription money. So I understand all that logic. But there's a nagging worry in my mind. In a way, there are two types of institution. There are institutions that publish, and there are institutions that read. And today, both the publish and the read institutions are paying money through subscriptions to meet the cost of publishing. Imagine that you've got a situation where suddenly half the content, even 3/4 of the content, is now freely available. The read institution is going to say, well, why should I pay into the system anymore? I have all the content for free. Why should I pay? And whilst there will be library consortia who might be able to make agreements between them in terms of moving the funding, if I think about the OECD is part of the Couperin consortium in France. In a scenario where a lot of content is free, the OECD will be unable to share the money to pay to publish scholarship from French resources. And the reason is because the funding that the OECD gets is allowed to buy content in, but that money would never be allowed to be used to help fund publishing costs in other institutions. The auditors wouldn't allow it. And I know in some countries it's actually against the law for public institutions to pay for things that otherwise should be free or could be free. And therefore, I think transformative agreements could lead to money being lost from the system. And therefore, you're compounding the funding problem that we have. But then there's the flip side, which is the published institutions are going to find that the cost, so they're spending X today on subscriptions, they're going to be spending X plus. So really big, and I wrote about this in one of my papers, is Hong Kong University. They currently spend about 7 million on subscriptions and APCs for a small section of their content today. If they paid APCs for all their content, it would cost them 12 million, and they're currently spending 7. They cannot afford that increase. So there's I don't think people really thought through the transformative agreements in terms of the wider impact, and that's why I don't think that they're going to.
Okay,
to be
I
a
see
success.
there are a lot of challenges. And is it possible to implement Plan S until 2021?
Well, personally, I doubt it. As I said earlier, first of all, it's a relatively small part of the puzzle. The requirements are expensive. And are quite stringent, and I think that's also another issue, which is to do with digital. Digital is more expensive than analog because there are many more things that you can do with digital. Plan S's requirements include a lot of very expensive developments that the publishers will have to make, and in a way the costs are only going to go up, and Plan S does not want the cost to go up, so there's a problem there. Now, I'm sure some publishers will get there, probably the bigger ones because they can afford to get there. The smaller publishers, I think, will struggle to get there. There's also the question of whether the authors will really go along with it, because the authors haven't been included in the discussions about Plan S. And if the authors want to publish in a journal that is not Plan S compliant, I can see there's a potential for conflict.
Yes. And as a librarian, I would like to know what is the role of the librarian in the open access movement?
Well, that's a huge question, and in fact I posed a similar question on Twitter on Monday. Is a library's job collection development, or is a library's job to provide services to their users and make their users more productive? Or indeed, is a library's job to become a publisher, which in some cases I can see that beginning to happen with repositories. I mean, after all, running a repository is like being a publisher. Yeah. So I think the role of a librarian, well, it's central in scholarly communications. I think the librarian has a tremendous amount to add because of their skills, and I think that I certainly don't. I think if a librarian stays in collection development, that may be a problem, because I think that probably is something that's going to become smaller over time. But if the librarian becomes, in a way, the information manager for their institution, working with the authors and advising authors on how to publish better, working with the readers in terms of providing services that make the readers more productive, then I think the librarian has a very important role.
Thank you.
Okay, so as we can see, there are a lot of open access challenges
a lot of
facing us in the future. Open access is not only one solution for all problems we're facing today, and thank you for being with us, and thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.